pero está como...
Bueno, déjale como un tiempo, yo le he dado ya a transmitir, ¿eh?
Ah, vale.
O sea, esto está...
Ah, ya está, ya se
¿Ya?
escucha.
¿Se
Sí,
escucha?
sí,
Okay.
se escucha.
Good. We have solved the audio problem. We're ready to start to begin again with the presentation. Nick, thank you so much for being here with us today. For anybody who doesn't know him, Nick is a professor of sociology at the University of Manchester. He writes about architecture and social housing, material cultures of publishing, and social theory. He's also the author of 3 books, the most recently, Brutalism as Found, Housing, Form and Crisis at Robin Hood Gardens, and he is currently writing a fabulation of Deleuze's unrealized final book, The Grandeur of Marx, which is the topic of the talk today, as you have seen, The Grandeur of Palestine, a fragment on Deleuze's midnight book on Marx. Thank you so much, Nick, for being with us.
Great, thanks very much for having me. Nice to be here, albeit virtually. So I'll talk for 40 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions. So in an interview conducted in 1993, 2 years before his death, Deleuze let it be known that he was writing a book called The Grandeur of Marx. It was to be his final book, as he characterized it in the interview, which was published shortly after he died. Deleuze reminds us here that Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus are completely traversed by Marx, by Marxism. That's a quote. And he trenchantly declares, "Today I can say that I feel completely Marxist." As for the announced book, however, its conditions of possibility were shaky at best. Deleuze's respiratory ill health had left him chained to an oxygen tank, struggling to breathe. Perhaps he'd even lost the desire to write, as he puts it in the interview. "My next book, and it will be the last, will be called The Grandeur of Marx. Today, I no longer feel like writing. After my book on Marx, I think I will stop writing. At that point, I will take up painting." It's unlikely then that much, if any, of the book was written, or that any notes will come to light, given Deleuze's stipulation against posthumous publication. Seeking Deleuze's Marx, one might thus turn instead to the Marxism that inheres already in Deleuze's published work. For Frederick Jameson was surely correct that Deleuze is alone among the great thinkers of so-called post-structuralism in having accorded Marx an absolutely fundamental role in his philosophy. That's a path I've taken myself in my first book on the question of Deleuze's Marx, but I'm currently writing a book that looks in the other direction, not back at the published work, but forward to what would have been new in the proposed book itself. I'm writing about a work unwritten. It sounds paradoxical, but it is part of book culture that we are drawn to lost, secret, and fabled books. As Giorgio van Straten puts it, such books have a powerful air of mystery and of quest, a childlike fascination of that which escapes us, a fascination intensified by the risk of an impossibility, as he quotes Proust. This fascination can be rather too wistful or conservative when we choose to lament missing books that we imagine would have perfected a writer's extant work, or even have changed the course of history. But if we ward off that risk, such books also bequeath to us, to their unreaders, the possibility of imagining them, of telling stories about them, of reinventing them, to quote Van Straten again. Or, in Deleuzean terms, such missing books bear and encourage myth-making, or what he calls, after Bergson, fabulation. And it's in this way that I'm writing with The Grandeur of Marx, as a fabulation, intuiting the direction of Deleuze's Marxist preoccupations in his last years, and this in a zigzagging relation with the political problems of our own late times. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the place of Palestine in the book, though I want to present something of the quality of Deleuze's unrealized book itself, what I call a midnight book, and the question therein of communist grandeur. So I've slightly, this talk is sort of a bit of a cut up. Parts of the book have kind of come together. My main focus is going to be on Palestine, but I'll get to that shortly. The The beautiful opening pages of What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari's last collaboration, evoke an impersonal creativity of old age at the midnight of life. That's their term. To quote them, there are times when there are times when old age produces not eternal youth, but a sovereign freedom, a pure necessity in which one enjoys a moment of grace between life and death, and in which all parts of the machine come together to send into the future a feature that cuts across all ages. Biographical time is a condition of such old age works, but their midnight creativity is out of time, or in time out of chronology, where past and future flood a self being undone by the proximity of death. Midnight works are not then the crowning moments of maturity, harmony, and resolution, the accepted notion of old age and wisdom. Neither is this Hegel's Owl of Minerva, taking flight at dusk when knowledge is achieved in the hindsight that grasps the present only as it passes. On the contrary, these midnight works are works pressed up into the limits and the crises of their present. They're works of intransigence, difficulty, and unresolved contradiction, to quote from Edward Said's own writing on late style. This tears them apart as works. It renders them as fragments and ruins, as tears and fissures, incomplete and unfinished. Late works are the catastrophes, as Said quotes Adorno, and one cannot but register here that Said's work on late style is conditioned by and carries the catastrophe and the revolution that is Palestine. For Deleuze and Guattari, midnight evokes also the swirling, unnerving, feverish time of becoming, of sorcery, of fabulation, when identity comes apart and other worlds and durations slide into being. Midnight is not the end then, but the in-between, the witching hour. So the stakes of old age are high then, and we should receive Deleuze's bold declaration of Marx's grandeur in this light. But what is this grandeur? And what would it be to place it at the heart of Deleuze's Midnight book? I'm going to approach that question in this talk in different ways, sort of different and repeating ways. But first of all, I'll look at it through Foucault and Marx and Marx's communism before moving to Palestine. Grandeur is a product of fabulation, both of which are concepts of Deleuze's later years, but their necessity for political praxis was already noted in 1972 in Anti-Oedipus. To quote from that book, "Flags, nations, armies, banks get a lot of people aroused. A revolutionary machine is nothing if it does not acquire at least as much force as these coercive machines have for producing breaks and mobilizing flows." As revolutionary myths, fabulations emerge in, grapple with, and potentialize conditions of social crisis, as visions that take over and compel insurgent praxis. Now, I will say more about that later, but for now, let me say that fabulations create giants, but giants of a strange kind. They are not the great figures of world history, like Hegel's Napoleon as world spirit on horseback, who sit comfortable and sure on their historical vector. Rather, fabulated giants are figures of infamy, to draw from Foucault's 1977 essay, Lives of Infamous Men. In this strange and paradoxical text, Foucault separates his idea of infamy from the false infamy of terrible legend, a Gilles de Rais or a Marquis de Sade. What he says is merely a subset of fame. Foucault's infamy, rather, is a quality of the banal criminal existences of the ordinary, obscure, insignificant, and unknown. It is the infamy of cobblers, army deserters, garment sellers, wet nurses, scriveners, vagabond monks, what he describes as billions of existences destined to pass away without a trace, who are illuminated for an instant by their clash with the institutions of law and authority, and discovered by chance in the historical archive. As handfuls of compressed words, these archival records are not clues to real historical characters. Foucault insists on this. They are not the memory of an oppressed existence. Rather, it's in the absolute absence of coherent lives in these recorded moments of violence and disarray that the particular affective quality that is infamy resides. So infamy, this is a quotation from Foucault, or bits of quotation from Foucault. Infamy, as he puts it, is the intensity, the shock of beauty mixed with dread, of lives that were lived and are yet wholly faceless. Poem lies, he says, flash existences, particles endowed with energy, all the greater for their being small and difficult to discern. They are not verbal portraits, but traps, weapons, cries, gestures, attitudes, ruses, intrigues. Now, Deleuze was captivated by Foucault's essay, considering it to be among his finest. He more than once he calls it a masterpiece. And he returns to it numerous times, working it in different ways, yet he never seems to quite know what to do with infamy itself. The absent presence of this beauty mixed with dread. And so the more Deleuze refines his typology of infamy and variously situates it in Foucault's work, the more infamy itself seems to recede from view. His midnight book on Marx, however, in its leading concept of grandeur, sets the conditions for the recovery and politicization of infamy, this impersonal beauty and shock of poem lives, traps, weapons, cries, gestures, attitudes, ruses, and intrigues. Infamy is to be found in the book not on the terrain of criminality as such, as it was for Foucault, but on the horizon of communism. Infamy as proletarian grandeur. Communism is at once precise and fearless critique, pressed up against the antagonism of its times, and it is fabulation, a fabulation populated by strange, infamous giants. Marx is one of these giants, its greatest. Marx perceives communism. He is a seer or a visionary in Deleuze's terms. And he makes this perception the condition of his thought and politics, in his grasping of the world in the torment of its antagonism and overcoming. In perceiving communism, communism also overtakes Marx, not only preceding and exceeding him in time, but taking a monstrous life of its own, a life which undoes him. It is Marx's demon, as he once characterized the volition of communist ideas. And I'm quoting him here from an early letter from 1842. These are ideas which conquer our intelligence, which overcome the outlook that reason has riveted to our conscience. Ideas as chains from which we cannot tear ourselves away without tearing out our hearts. They are demons that man can overcome only by submitting to them. Communism is a demon that one can only overcome by submitting to it. Overtaking and undoing him, communism also renders Marx infamous in a specifically communist way. Deleuze remarks that Foucault wished infamy for himself. To quote Deleuze, to be an infamous man was a sort of dream for Foucault, to be carried away in the anonymous murmur of discourse, faceless and impersonal against the constraint of the self and the banality of fame. But Marx's infamy goes further than this, where the subtraction of his self and of anyone else and of any doctrine and of any particular organization is to be carried away in the expansive horizon of communism. It is an horizon which is imminent to every moment of proletarian antagonism, or potentially so. Those billions of faceless existences against the identification and limitation of communism into concentrated centers of leadership and authority. After all, in Marx's slogan, the emancipation of the working class must be conquered by the working class itself. We can even find Marx directly expressing how this infamous grandeur pertained to himself. So here is a quotation from 1877, towards the end of his life, where he says, in a letter, he says, both of us scoff at being popular. He's referring to himself and Engels. Both of us scoff at being popular. Among other things, our disgust at any personality cult is evidence of this. When Engels and I first joined the secret society of communists, we did it on the condition, above all, that they repeal all statutes that would be favorable to a cult of authority. Lassalle, on the other hand, i.e. statist politics, subsequently operated in the reverse direction. So that is Marx's grandeur. It's a paradoxical grandeur. His grandeur comes in negating his own grandeur, and in that negation lies the grandeur of communism. Now, in my book, this grandeur of Marx variously joins or loses prominence to, or falls away completely to different problems, concepts, antagonisms, and events. Grandeur isn't the only focus of the book, in other words. But I want to keep the focus on grandeur today and turn now to Deleuze's engagement with Palestine to understand what the grandeur of Palestine might be for Deleuze, and to understand what Palestine might do to Deleuze, you know, looking in the other direction too. After years of neglect, it is now well known that Deleuze penned a series of 4 texts on the Palestinian Revolution against the settler colonial state of Israel. Acute and impassioned texts written over the course of a decade from 1978, following the first Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon and the expulsion of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, from its stronghold therein. The first of these texts, titled Spoilers of Peace, identifies the devastating heart of the Palestinian condition. Deleuze writes, "The Palestinians were never given any choice other than unconditional surrender. All they were offered was death." Israel envelops Palestinian life in death, a changing constant since the ethnic cleansing of the 1948 Nakba and the Zionist terror campaigns that preceded the state's founding. In the 1980s, Deleuze called this a cold genocide. Quote, "With colder means than genocide, one ends up with the same result." Today, as we know, any remaining fetters have been cast aside as Israel pursues its terrible and all-consuming genocidal slaughter in Gaza and pogroms in the West Bank, armed, funded, and legitimized by its US and European partners. I'm not going to focus on this today, however. Instead, I will take up the question of Palestinian resistance, a focus which is denied, besmirched, and criminalized by humanitarian logics as they segue into today's naked and avowed fascism. Deleuze's most advanced account of what he calls the fabulation function is in a late essay on T.E. Lawrence's book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, a book which recounts and mythologizes Lawrence's experiences as a British imperial officer fomenting and participating in the 1916-18 Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. I'm uncomfortable turning to this Orientalist text, especially in discussion of Palestine, but Deleuze extracts from it a singular study in the techniques of fabulation. And he does so at precisely the moment he was turning his mind to the grandeur of Marx in 1991. Titled The Shame and the Glory, it is the second time that he uses the word grandeur, or a close cognate, in the title of an essay about revolt in the Middle East. But why did he choose here not to engage with contemporary Palestinian struggle? This was a period of desperate crisis, the trap of the peace process picking up pace with the 1991 Madrid conference, and Yasser Arafat, the subject of Deleuze's earlier essay on grandeur, long set on a path to capitulation. It called for a response, just as the previous four texts had each been prompted by critical events in Palestine's turbulent history. Or perhaps The Shame and the Glory is his response to the Palestinian contemporary. Or this is my fabulation, that The Shame and the Glory is a fifth text in Deleuze's Palestine series, and one where the fullest articulation of grandeur is entwined with armed revolt, and this in an infamous form, a grandeur that excludes even the hero. My basis for this fabulation is that in the essay's attention to Lawrence's wrenching of grandeur from the depths of shame, and in its occasional direct references, one can discern an interlocutory exchange with Jean Genet, with Genet's writing about his time with the Palestinian Fedayeen, or resistance fighters, in the early 1970s and early 1980s. So it is this virtual essay, this virtual fifth essay on Palestine, that I will partially draw out here and in the rest of this talk. It is one of three modalities of Palestinian grandeur that my book is concerned with. The other two, which I won't be discussing today, are the grandeur of Arafat in relation to the fabulation of Palestine as an armed nation through the PLO, and the other, the grandeur of land with regard to the stones of the First Intifada and certain images of liberation that burst forth around the Al-Aqsa flood breakout from the Gaza blockade. So, to the infamous grandeur of the Fedayeen, this virtual fifth essay. I'll start by picking up where I left off earlier about fabulation. So Deleuze finds in Lawrence a compulsive disposition to create fabulous and agential images in the service of armed revolt. That's the heart of the matter for him. Where fabulation, to quote Deleuze, is a machine for manufacturing giants. And to continue that quotation, fabulation is a tendency to project into things, into reality, into the future, and even into the sky, an image of himself and others so intense that it has a life of its own, an image that is always stitched together, patched up, continually growing along the way to the point where it becomes fabulous. Now, there's a lot going on in that passage, so I want to unpack it in a few steps. The first target of such fabulation is representation. What matters in a fabulation is not the representation of real events. Lawrence's fabulation has no need to correspond to a pre-existing reality, Deleuze says, which is often rather limited. The insignificance of many of his undertakings, his ineptitude in planting bombs, none of which he hides. Rather, fabulation scrambles the real with the fictional. It is at once fantasy and report, Deleuze writes. As the Palestinian writer Abdel Jawad Omar puts it, with regard to Palestinian visioning of freedom today, to quote him, this is allowing the imaginary to invade you, to simultaneously unthink the world and daydream, to be playful with images rather than bound by logical worlds and words. Deleuze, for his part, calls this falsifying narration in another text. Pre-established truths, he continues, the world of representation is always that of the masters, the colonizers. Fabulation, instead, is a power of the false, the fashioning of new truths through the fiction, through falsifying the true, through partisan truths, through visions of abolition, of victory, of other worlds, visions forged under conditions of social crisis. Or put otherwise, fabulation is, quote, the flagrant offense of making up legends, the fabulation function of the poor, insofar as it gives the false the power which makes it into a memory, a legend, a monster. As a legend, a monster, the function of fabulated grandeur is not then to represent the real. It is valid through the intensity it projects into the real, where it draws together, mesmerizes, exhilarates, and accelerates revolt. To this end, its autonomy, or a strange kind of quasi-autonomy, is key. In its falsifying, monstrous, patched-together form, grandeur has a free indirect quality. That is, it's loosened from any direct indexing to a coherent subject or a coherent collectivity as it emerges and circulates through the diverse, crisis-ridden quarters. Rather, it gains a life of its own. So it's not indexed to any particular constituency. It has a certain autonomy. It gains a life of its own. A disorienting, uncanny, hallucinatory quality, which then folds back on the milieu of its creation to become there a cause. Cracking open the coordinates of subjection through a visionary image of rupture and lives lived otherwise. I'm not sure I'm quite so clear here, but this sense in which fabulations and fabulated giants emerge out of social conditions, but those social conditions are so crisis-ridden, it's not entirely clear where it emerges from, but it gains a kind of autonomy, it's built up, and then in that autonomy that reacts back on those conditions to drive them forward. So it's a quasi-cause. As Genet has it, fabulation charges the real with grandeur in its most non-existent branches. That's his phrase. The real not as it is in its roots, but the real as it is emerging in its fractures and in its revolts. Second, these fabulation and grandeur is impersonal. Impersonal. In the Lawrence essay, grandeur is inseparably political, erotic, and artistic, but it is not of Lawrence's person. It is not some contemptible individual mythomania, Deleuze writes. For in Lawrence's, to keep quoting him, for in Lawrence's undertaking is a cold and concerted destruction of the ego, carried to its limit. Every time he plants every mine he plants also explodes within himself. He is himself the bomb he detonates. It's an extraordinary phrase. It's impersonal and it's collective. These fabulous images are a function of the revolutionary undertaking, where Deleuze writes, the projection machine or the fabulation machine is inseparable from the movement of the revolt and its revolutionary group, which are molded more and more on the projected images, images that make giants of them. They're molded, but not as imitation. And now we can turn to Genet, and I'll only be focusing on Genet for the rest of this talk. The Genet, as I said, that is kind of virtually present in Deleuze's essay. I'm drawing mostly from Genet's posthumously published memoir, Prisoner of Love. Genet is keenly attentive here to the risk of images of grandeur succumbing to cliché. The co-determination of fabulous images and revolutionary actions is not to confirm, but to exceed each other. Image-action conjunctions that draw their poetry from the future, to use Marx's phrase. Genet finds this among what he calls the anonymous heroes of the Fedayeen, though not in their worn-out news media representations. The Fedayeen, he says, were so opposite to what they were said to be by the press that their radiance, their very existence, derived from that negation. He's withering of Western journalists arranging Kalashnikov-toting Fedayeen into assorted poses, what they were said to be, and he finds Arafat suggesting similar, paraphrasing him thus. The revolution's in danger of becoming unreal through rhetoric, images on screens, and metaphor and hyperbole in everyday speech. Our battles are in danger of turning into poses. They look heroic, but in fact they are performed. Revolutionary grandeur, infamous grandeur, manifests instead in what Genet calls the Fedayeen's beauty, an aesthetic quality of lives and environments in revolt. It is an insolent beauty, not the terrain of sexuality, beyond all eroticism, he writes, and beyond the muscular machismo of the Leninist and Marinist iconography of those years. Beauty is indexed rather to shame. What for Deleuze is the searing, visionary, subject-shattering experience of perceiving the intolerable violence and cruelty of the world. Shame, many of you will know, is a kind of vital political concept of Deleuze's later years. And grandeur and shame in Genet and in Deleuze very much come together. This is a beauty in combat with shame, beauty in shame's overcoming. This struggle with shame explains how Genet, in his essay 4 Hours in Shatila, is able or compelled to devote his literary powers to the Fedayeen's beauty amid his unflinching reportage of the Sabra and Shatila massacre. In September 1982, Israeli-supported Lebanese militia rampaged for 40 continuous hours, slaughtering some 3,000 men, women, and children. Entering the Shatila camp the morning after, Genet writes of the tortured and eviscerated bodies piled up in the alleyways. The shame of the massacre pressed into every nerve of his being to the edge of insanity. Only in this magnitude of shame can beauty be achieved and sustained, charged by what it must abolish. And I think one has to sort of read that incomparable essay to really feel that. Beauty then is a shedding. It is a shedding of the ugly weight of shame, of colonialism, of mere survival in the refugee camps. As Genet asks rhetorically, is a revolution if it does not remove from the faces and bodies and the dead skin that distorted them? I'm not talking about an academic beauty, but rather the impalpable, unnameable joy of bodies, faces, shouts, words that are no longer dead. It is a shedding of identity too. Beauty is impersonal, in excess of and sundering the human subject. Deleuze writes in a different context that in beauty we are grasped or we are swept away by something unbearable in the world, something too powerful or too unjust, but sometimes also too beautiful, and which henceforth outstrips our sensory motor capacity. So a beauty that undoes our habits and our capacities to sort of move and be in the world. Cleaved from and against identity, Deleuze finds such grandeur or beauty in the margins, gestures, styles, artifacts of grand historical figures. So he writes this is very early, this is 1967. He says, "It happens from time to time at certain great moments when the people struggle for their liberation, there is always a coincidence of poetic acts and historical events or political actions, the glorious incarnation of something sublime or untimely. Such great coincidences are Nasser's burst of laughter when he nationalized the Suez Canal, or Castro's gestures, and that other burst of laughter, General Zap's television interview, General Zap, the leader of the North Vietnamese Viet Cong." So Deleuze finds these kind of flashes of beauty as they break away from these grand historical figures. And Genet, I think, finds something similar, but now in the mountains with the Fedayeen, not with the great historical figures at all, but with what we saw him call the anonymous heroes of the revolution. So Genet writes, the feeling in the air, the color of the sky, the earth and the trees. He refers to gestures, eyes, tones, words, and then a long quotation. In the forests themselves, there settled all the sensuality liberated by rebellion and by rifles, the vivacity of their gestures and their visible wariness, the quickness and brilliance of the eye, the clearer tone of voice, all became allied with a swift response and with its brevity. Everything belonged to everyone, a beauty so alive that it immediately revealed its attunement with all the beauties of the world that have been freed from shame. Befitting beauty's nature as a dimension of revolution, it is also flickering, evanescent. Seen through the lens of insurgent practice, this is a feature of the Fedayeen's guerrilla capacity to vanish into the landscape, a skill or an art born of the necessity of war. Today, Gaza's network of tunnels can be viewed in the same light, constructed with an aesthetic collusion with the clay layer of the earth, where the Palestinian resistance fashions a politics of opacity in this refined and effective subterranean means of movement, concealment, fugitivity, and combat. The evanescence of beauty first strikes Genet as a haunting fear, a fear that the Palestinian revolution risks fading, flagging, he writes. I looked at the resistance as if it was going to vanish at any moment. But his fabulation transmutes this fragility into a singular quality of revolution itself, the untimely and unnameable event. To quote him, the fact that the Fedayeen were like ghosts, appearing and disappearing, lent them a life more powerful than that of things that never evaporate and whose image is always there. The evanescence is more powerful than the permanence because that signifies and bears the evanescence of revolution itself, the rupture of revolution itself. The effervescence of the Fedayeen's beauty, their impersonal shedding of identity, expresses also the kernel of revolution that operates within and against Palestinian nationhood. The day the Palestinians become an institution, Genet declares, I will no longer be on their side. The day the Palestinians become a nation like other nations, I won't be there anymore. It's a shocking statement, intransigent and true. True to the world abolition that is revolution, true to infamy, true to Palestine. As Edward Said picks up this thread, Genet's deliberate and logical dismantling of identity is not only directed at the French imperialist nation, but also at the logic of identity in Palestinian anti-colonial nationalism. It is how to make sense of the otherwise incongruous meeting of Genet's infamous affirmation of betrayal in his early work with his passionate commitment and solidarity to the Palestinian revolution. For in this final work, the anti-ethics of betrayal is transvalued into the betrayal of revolution's betrayal. Betrayal is an ecstasy, he says. Anyone who hasn't experienced the ecstasy of betrayal knows nothing about ecstasy at all. But now, this ecstasy of betrayal is engendered by solidarity with revolution itself. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much, Nick. Hello. Thank you very much, Nick, for your talk. That idea of fabulation, I felt that was very inspiring and related to how Deleuze, used other philosophers' work. So thank you so much. I want to open the floor to anybody that is here that wants to ask a question before we say anything. I don't know if anybody of you wants to talk. I have a little question that has come up for me in our talk, Nick, because the idea of the Palestinian resistance and resonated with me very much around the idea of minor politics, and that idea of Deleuze is that the people are always missing, right? And I know that in your book on Deleuze, Marx, and politics, you talk a little bit about these issues and how do you relate them to communism. And I was wondering if you could make a link between these ideas, right? Between communism, Palestinian resistance, and the idea of a minor politics.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Very happy to to address that. So I think it's evident really that Palestine is the most pressing instance for him of minor political praxis. I don't think that pressing and continuous, those 4 essays are written over a decade. I don't think there's a comparable example of anywhere near that importance in his work to him, which is interesting because those essays were, ignored really for a long time. And the way that Deleuze writes his books is contemporary political events don't really tend to have a huge presence, which is kind of even 1,000 Plateaus. There's the chapter toward the plateau towards the end that does engage a little bit with Italian operaismo and autonomia, but even then it's at quite a level of sort of abstraction. Palestine barely features in his books. There's the odd nod to it, and the nod sort of has this, it seems to have this kind of sense of affirmation and confirmation, almost like, well, of course we know. So I think if reading at the time, one would see Palestine as more central to his work than when we read it now. So that's the sort of biographical point, that I think Palestine is fundamental to his theory of the minoritarian. I don't think he came to the minor via Palestine. That arrives with the Kafka book, really, which is written in 75. He doesn't encounter Palestine until sort of 77, 78. But I do think Palestine then pushes him in different directions, or pushes the minor in different directions, as does his writing of the cinema book, the second cinema book, where it's the terrain of the minor shifts from Kafka and the collapse of the Habsburg Empire into the colonial condition. So I think that's very much a kind of anti-colonial reading of the minor, which is not Palestine, but clearly fits with a broader sort of anti-colonial / Palestinian approach. So first of all, I think Palestine is really fundamental to how he thinks the minor. The question then is whether Palestinians think the minor applies to them. And Deleuze really, I think, was really quite wary of not wanting to sort of impose conceptual systems on top of other people's struggles. And it's perhaps one thing to read Kafka historically through the minor, and indeed, of course, it's a term that Kafka uses, or the literature of small peoples. And so I'm always a bit wary of, I think to use the minoritarian to talk about Palestine, we have to let Palestine see what it's taking from Deleuze too, and I think Deleuze sees that as well. So when that very beautiful interview with Elias Sambar in Libération, which is, we count as one of the 4 of those Deleuze Palestine texts, Deleuze gives the preface. It's strange, he gives this introductory note to, because this conversation is what's the word, announcing, celebrating the new journal, the Journal of Palestinian Studies, which Sambar created. And he created it with the help of Deleuze, insofar as Deleuze introduced Sambar to his editor when no one else would publish the journal. So Deleuze had this sort of small role in the start of the journal, and Sambar was a very close friend of his all the way through his life, from 78 to his death. And so Deleuze is invited to introduce this journal to the French, liberal culture or French intellectual culture, and he plots it in certain ways that I think are rather minor, but you can see him being careful, not wanting to impose his system on top of it. So then if we take that, I think the next thing perhaps to say is I have a very long chapter on Palestine in my book, which is some of which I've been reading. You look at Edward Said's book, The Question of Palestine, which is, the first sort of big global book, non-Arabic book on Palestine. It was published in 1979. It's very easy to read that with a kind of minor lens, or it's very easy to see Said expressing Palestine in very minoritarian terms. I don't think Deleuze read Said's book, interestingly, because I don't think his English was particularly good. It's interesting that I'm not sure if it's really known. I think he could struggle through English, but not so much more, and it wasn't translated into French until quite a lot later. But he will have encountered Said via Sambar. He will have encountered Said directly or indirectly via the Journal of Palestinian Studies. So I don't know whether Said influenced Deleuze, but certainly Said talks about it in ways that are very close to Deleuze. That is, the Palestinians are an absolutely missing people. They are constituted in their negation. That line that I open with, the Palestinians have been offered nothing but death. It's a death that's preceded by an absolute voiding of their cultural and social and political existence in the past, in the future, for all time. You couldn't have a more missing people in Deleuze's terms than the Palestinians. And you have a state whose very existence is determined by destroying the existence of this people. So the sense with Palestine is that the major and the minor come together in this appalling battle that absolutely, with Israel being the major form, absolutely negates them. They're a far-flung population, they're fragmented, they're riven by relationships to a multitude of different political ideologies, national pressures, citizenship, refugees, various gradations of rights in relationship to the Israeli state, subject to genocidal warfare. You couldn't have a more minor people. So I think in that sense, absolutely. The question then is the flip side of that, in the sense that the minor for Deleuze is a political category. It's not a way of describing oppression. It's a way of describing oppression as the ground for the most extraordinary, the most inventive, the most revolutionary politics one could imagine. And I think that's what's going on when he tunes into resistance in those Palestinian essays. Even, I think he tunes into resistance in those essays, but he doesn't say very much. So that's partly what I'm drawing out, the fabulation dimensions. But he says, and this is Said's line, it's also Arafat's line, Palestine went from being a population of decimated refugees into an insurgent force. And Deleuze says they became an armed nation. That's his terms, an armed nation. And it's in that, through the PLO, becoming an armed nation, that this kind of missing people becomes revolutionary. They don't become a people, they become a missing revolutionary people. So then your other question, how does that relate to communism? I mean, we can go back to that resistance part in a tick, but how it relates to communism. You mentioned my book, Deleuze, Marx and Politics. One of the main points in that book, and it's something I completely adhere to, if not even more today, is that I see Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the missing people and the new earth simply and wholly as figures of communism. So the missing people is the proletariat in Marx, and the new earth is communism as the abolition of capitalism. I think Deleuze and Guattari do that in their own way, with a whole plethora of concepts that are and are not Marxist. But I think it's entirely and utterly a figure of communism and the proletariat. It's a certain reading of the proletariat and communism, a reading that pushes away Stalinism and Trotskyism and Maoism, and it gets to something of a kind of revolutionary core in Marx, that is the proletariat as self-abolition. But it's not, but it's absolutely communism. And I'm doing much more of that in this current book, that sense in which so if I'm fabulating Deleuze's missing book, one of the sort of wagers is that in Deleuze's old age, he would have to have given up some of those fetters that held him back on some of the communist angles. He can't write the greatness of Marx, the grandeur of Marx, and then be ambivalent about communism. You can't take on the grandeur of Marx and say, but I'm not sure that communism quite worked as our framework. He was going to go all in. He was absolutely going to go all in. It was going to be a book of communism, Deleuze's communism, the grandeur of Deleuze's reading of Marx's communism. It's impossible to imagine it would have been anything else. And hence all of that stuff about the works of midnight, when it's as if at midnight the absolute chaos takes over, total chaos. William Turner, instead of just painting catastrophes, he then lets the subject, the catastrophe, take over the painting, tear the painting apart, and I think that's a midnight book has to approach that. And I think that's what I fabulate Deleuze would have done. Of course, I can't do that. I'm not old enough yet. But that's what I think Deleuze would have done. I mean, it's a fabulation. We know that he was too sick to do it. He was already just too old to really do that. But that's not the point. The fabulation is what would this have been if it was to be true to that notion.
Sure. We were also wondering about the place that hegemon. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to pronounce this. How do hegemonia?
Hegemony or hegemony.
Sure, yeah. Thank you. That's a mouthful for me. What role does it play here? What role do you think it plays when we are talking about these people that are always missing? If we're constructing a politics that is without a subject, right, without an identity, without a solid, nucleus, then what does it mean about hegemony?
So I think hegemony hegemony is a word that I sometimes use sort of in shorthand, as a way of thinking about a kind of ideological, social ideological kind of formation at the level of a kind of national or even perhaps regional kind of culture or political culture. It's not a concept I use politically, and it's not a concept that Deleuze and Guattari use. I mean, they're sort of writing before that. Obviously it's a Gramscian concept. When we talk about it as a political concept, it's a Gramscian concept. I don't think Gramsci had the kind of influence in France that he had at a certain period in Europe, or at least in the US and the UK in the 1980s. For me, it came via kind of British cultural studies, people like Stuart Hall, the Birmingham Centre, and then Anessa Leclau and Chantal Mouffe's famous book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, and I detest that book, the Leclau Mouffe book, and I also read it at a certain time in my life when Marxism was really being battered, at least in the academy, by all sorts of liberal narratives that imagined that they had far surpassed the sort of terrible economic determinism of Marxism or something like that. And that book was very much the agent of that narrative. And so it was pushing, as they understood it, it was pushing from kind of economic struggle into cultural struggle, fed into the British Labour Party, it fed into Tony Blair, all of this stuff. so I don't like it at all. I don't use it as a concept, and I think that books like 1,000 Plateaus, especially, but also Anti-Oedipus, just give us a very different set of tools for engaging with social formation that are not on this level of the sort of the hegemonic. So the question for me then is, when you said how do we gain hegemony if we're always missing, I sort of take that to mean, you know, if we're missing, or if the people are missing, if the minoritarian is always a non-subject, how the hell can it have any, are you saying how could it have any kind of consistency or development or grasp at the level of the national popular? I think that's a real it's obviously a real question. And I think the answer is that it can't. So I think the social democratic answer, the hegemony answer is yes, it can. We join the Labour Party in Britain, or we form another liberal social democratic party, or we call ourselves radical Democrats or whatever, and we start to build, you know, a sort of hegemonic front, that kind of thing. I've never seen it. I've seen it in words. I haven't seen it in practice, because these institutions always and invariably and inevitably just reproduce the same thing. Now, I'm not then saying that means one can't engage with those kinds of developments, but I think we have to see them, if you like, for want of a better, almost as much of the enemy as the enemy. So we have to be working with and against and beyond, and be very, very wary of them. You know, so then you say, well, all right, great. So where does change come from? And that, I think, is the real question for Deleuze. So it's not like, it's not, you know, their position really is that no, change doesn't come, revolutionary change doesn't come easily at all, but let's not delude ourselves in thinking that it will come by forming a leftist political party in government, I suppose. So where does it come? Well, you know, for them it comes to some extent, it comes in all the time, in everyday struggles, in the moments when something is broken and cracked and exceeds the strictures of, you know, power, identity, work, the commodity, you know, what have you. These kind of little flashes throughout life. The question then is, how do those somehow build into a revolutionary position? And I've come to the view really that they won't, except in moments of kind of crisis, and we are now in moments of crisis. You know, with kind of the crisis of sort of global migration, with global war, with Palestine, with Iran, you know, with the environmental crisis. We are in an era of crisis, and it's so, from my own sort of perspective, I feel as I'm writing now, it's such a different time to when I wrote that first book. I think probably when I wrote that first book, I still had my head in the sand about the kind of environmental crisis, but no one can have that now. So is there going to be change? Yeah, because capitalism is absolutely destroying the planet. Is it going to head to barbarism before it heads to communism? Entirely possible that will happen, but it's not going to carry on like this for too much longer. That's my feeling. So in a way, the question of where will the change come from, I think is probably not really needed quite so much today. You know, obviously I still support strikes and collective organizing against regeneration, social movements to sort of reclaim space. All of these kinds of things are vital and very important, and enable people to live politically, critically, which, you know, which we all want all the time. So those are important. I don't want to sound kind of depressive about it, but I wouldn't read it through the question of hegemony. I guess that's the.
I was also wondering about the idea of fabulation that you talked about during your presentation. You said that what matters in fabulation is not the correspondence with real events, because it scrambles the real with the fictional, right? That, of course, relates very much to the minor question that we were talking about earlier, the idea of Kafka and how, Deleuze and Guattari describe the minor as a collective enunciation and as a transformation of the language from a major language to a minor language. And I was wondering if you think about this fabulation as a war machine, as they put it in 1,000 Plateaus.
Yeah, I do think of it as a war machine, and there's that nice line that you've used as the epigram for this conference, isn't there, about the PLO as a war machine?
Yeah.
So the war machine's a concept that I don't tend to use myself, not because I don't like it, but I find that it involves quite a lot of sort of explanation to move on, particularly because of the word war.
Yeah.
I kind of intuitively understand war to mean kind of class war, something along those lines, that this is it's a class war that is radically identitarian. So fabulation was definitely a tool or a means of the class war. It's definitely a means of the war machine. I think that's why that Lawrence essay is interesting, because although Deleuze does touch on armed struggle in the other essays, and in the last one, the one that's called Wherever They See It, or Stones, depending on the edition, he talks about the unarmed struggle of the Intifada, of the first Intifada. I I think Deleuze would have no time for that distinction between the unarmed and the armed, which I think we're all, if we were sometimes tempted by that, I think since the start of the genocide or beforehand, we kind of all know that that's actually a rather sort of silly division. So I think the sense of war, the war machine, rather than, I don't know, the direct action machine or something, is something I'm perhaps a bit more ready to entertain than maybe I might have been in the past. In the past I might not have been so keen to put war up front, whereas now I'm more in that mindset, I suppose. Albeit that they keep saying, it's a very complicated concept, isn't it? They say the war machine invented war, but war was not its object, or something like that. Like, okay, well, and it only becomes war when the state takes it over, so I love all of that stuff in their work, but it does make it sometimes a bit hard to use. And maybe just on this unarmed armed thing, I stressed it in the talk, but I'd say it again now, is Deleuze makes it very clear that the Palestinians created themselves through the PLO in 1967 as an armed nation. This is the fun. They became an insurgent armed nation. He wasn't going to follow that up with, but if only they had a more distributed, they weren't, direct action, then it would have been truly minor, and that somehow, taking up arms was a state formation or something like that. That said, Deleuze, like everybody else, of a Marxist orientation, was of course enamored by the Intifada because it was so wide and distributed and against sort of elitist forms of agency and stuff. But I think that armed non-armed thing is a false polarity. There are differences, but it's a false polarity. I can't imagine one would talk to many Palestinians involved in politics today that would think that was a useful division.
Okay, so I will reiterate to everybody, if anybody has any questions, anything that they want to talk about with us, with Nick, then you're very welcome to do so. We're a bit shy this morning, I see. So, I mean, I don't know. What So it's a bit early, but if nobody has anything else to talk about, you know, I've said my questions, everything. I think it was a really interesting conversation. Nick, thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for accepting the invitation. And thank you for this wonderful and inspiring talk.
And if you want to follow the rest of the conference,
yeah.
We would be like on YouTube, or we can like send it to you the link. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you, Nick.
Well, many thanks for having me and for your questions. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.